you?
Fire department.
The roof just collapsed at the Algo Center Mall.
The Algo Center Mall roof just collapsed?
Yes, sir.
It's from number 1. We're responding to Algo Center Mall for report of roof collapse. Be advised, looking in through the front doors, I can see water flowing and a hole from the second floor down.
Yeah, Chief, we have at least one patient trapped in a void.
Just be advised, we haven't heard anything from the victims probably for about an hour now.
Those chilling voices you just heard date back nearly 14 years to a tragic Saturday afternoon in Elliot Lake, Ontario. On June 23, 2012, a portion of the Algo Center Mall's rooftop parking deck suddenly caved in, sending thousands of pounds of concrete, steel, and other debris crashing into the plaza below. 2 women, Lucy Alwyn and Dolores Perizzolo, were killed in the collapse, while 19 others were injured. All these years later, the Elliot Lake tragedy is back in the headlines amid news that a proposed $10 million settlement has been reached in a long-standing class action lawsuit. Welcome back to Closer Look with Michael Friscolanti, our editor-in-chief. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Okay, Frisco, let's get into this because when this happened, you were a senior writer at Maclean. So maybe take us back to that day and how your coverage unfolded.
Yeah, a lot of memories have flooded back because I covered this case not only the weekend of the collapse and the days after, but also in the years after because, as we're going to get into today, there was a massive public inquiry. There were multiple lawsuits. There was a criminal investigation. There was all kinds of tentacles that happened after this collapse happened. But yeah, just to give you a kind of a brief overview, just so everybody knows, we're going to speak to one of the class action lawyers representing the plaintiffs today. Yeah. But before we get to that, I think it's just good to go over some of the background. And honestly, Scott, I've just been rereading things like crazy. I mean, the public inquiry report is 1,300 pages, and the executive summary is, I think, 100 pages. I went through that again, went through a bunch of my old coverage. But anyways, if you remember, the rescue operation really captivated the country for a few days because there's this terrible collapse. Then we know that 2 people are trapped, and their initial numbers were really high, but then we found out soon enough it was 2 people. I was in Toronto at the time, and I actually booted up to Elliot Lake and got there, I believe, on the day after the collapse. And the reason it got so much attention at the time, too, was because they spent a couple days searching. There was a special unit from Toronto that came up, a heavy urban search and rescue team. Right. And there was all kinds of, frantic efforts to get to these people that were trapped in there. And the gist of it was there were sets of escalators that came down from the rooftop parking lot, and pieces of concrete slabs had landed on these escalators, and they were kind of precariously hanging there, supported by steel beam. So you can imagine the engineers who work for the Ministry of Labor. There was a Ministry of Labor engineer. There was an engineer with the heavy urban search rescue team. Mm-hmm. They're constantly looking at these beams, doing their calculations. Is it going to give way? Because if it gave way, that stuff would have all slid onto the rescuers below. Okay. And they're not going to let people be in there. Of course not. So after a couple days, the search was all of a sudden called off. And the way it was worded by the leader at the time, as the public inquiry found, was it really was like, it's over, we're going home, you're going to have to get someone else in here to recover what we think are the dead bodies. Oh. It went over awful in Elliot Lake. And of course, the people were furious that evening. They were threatening to storm the mall themselves. And it actually took political intervention from Premier Dalton McGuinty at the time, who actually kind of phoned and said, is there anything more we can do? In the end, they brought a huge crane in, removed all that debris they were concerned about that was hanging from the escalator, and were able to go in through the front door and retrieve what ended up being 2 bodies. One of the, from the rescue perspective, one of the questions that we'll never know for sure it was if Lucy Alwyn was still alive for a little while. They know that Dolores Perizzolo was killed immediately. In fact, I spoke to a firefighter at the time, shortly after this all happened, who found her and actually was able to take a pulse. And she was buried under some rubble, but she had passed away. Yeah. And so, mercifully, she had died instantly, I think, and that's what they concluded. But there was a lot of debate about whether Lucy had survived up to 39 hours. There were different signs of life. They were using sniffer dogs. They were using devices. Yeah. And we'll just never know that answer. So in the aftermath of all that, they called the province called a public inquiry. I think people were so angry they wanted to know what happened with this rescue. But more than that, I remember being there and everyone talking about the rescue efforts, but also people saying, we knew this was going to happen. This mall was a disaster for 30 years. It leaked for 30 years. People had sounded the alarm bells that this was a structural disaster waiting to happen.
It was like everyone knew.
Everyone knew.
At one point.
Everyone knew that it was kind of like, and it was, I hate to say it, but people said it to me. It was like a running joke. Well, one day a car is going to go through the rooftop parking lot, and that is kind of exactly what happened. What we know now, and only we know now, because there was such an exhaustive public inquiry, and I did cover it for Maclean's, and I wrote so much about it, and I've just been rereading things just to refresh my memory. It's been 14 years.
Exactly, yeah.
But rarely do you have a catastrophe like this that's investigated so thoroughly where there's a public inquiry. It was a $20 million public commission. There were hearings. There was evidence given. There was Justice Paul Belanger was the head of the inquiry. He had a team of lawyers working for him. It was like a trial, but not a trial. The goal of a public inquiry is to find facts and make recommendations.
Right.
It's not to lay blame. It's not to decide who's liable, things like that. So it's not saying this person's to blame. But in the course of finding the facts, the commissioner was had some harsh words for a lot of people. What we know for sure, and everyone knew from the beginning, was that all that water, that it was not properly waterproofed, this roof, so it leaked for 30 years, and eventually it so thoroughly corroded and rusted out some of the steel beams that basically a welded connection gave way, and everything came crashing down. So it took 5 minutes for engineers to discover that's what happened.
Of course, yeah.
The why was the big question, right?
Right.
And I'll read this. This was one of the final quotes from the commission, from Justice Belanger. Although it was rust that defeated the structure of the Algo Mall, the real story behind the collapse is one of human, not material failure. Many of those whose calling or occupation touched the mall displayed failings. Its designers and builders, its owners, some architects and engineers, as well as the municipal and provincial officials charged with the duty of protecting the public. Some of these failings were minor, some were not. They range from apathy, neglect, and indifference, through mediocrity, ineptitude, and incompetence, to outright greed, obfuscation, and duplicity. Occasional voices alarm blew by deaf and callous ears. Warning signs went unseen by eyes likely averted for fear of jeopardizing the continuing existence of the mall, the social and economic hub of Elliot Lake. I remember reading those words. I remember Justice Belanger saying them at the post-inquiry press conference. It was hugely powerful. Another line that I think is important for people to understand, he wrote this: based on any fair and objective analysis of the history of the Algo Mall as it unfolded during the commission's hearings, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that if any one of the owners, engineers, or officials who were involved with the mall over its 33 years of existence had insisted, enough, this building will fail if it isn't fixed, 2 lives would not have been senselessly and tragically lost. It was very clear that this mall was kind of doomed from the beginning. It was poorly designed. It wasn't properly waterproofed, and owner after owner did the bare minimum to keep it going.
Just a Band-Aid,
Just
right?
a Band-Aid, right? Just a Band-Aid. Do the bare minimum. There were so many engineers that went through. There were some that made very detailed reports about how the structure of this mall could be compromised if it's not properly fixed, and others that just kind of did the basics and didn't go anything near that. There were a few times, again, the public inquiry report's 1,300 pages, but there were a few times where, there were some email chains that are just shocking. There was one in 2006 involving the new chief administrative officer and one city councilor. And the councilor wrote, "The thing that I am really worried about is the possibility of the roof caving in with cars parked up there," right? And the commissioner was pretty harsh on the city, talking about how basically his conclusion was Elliot Lake had transitioned from a mining town to a retirement living community, and the mall was so central to the recruitment process to get people to move to Elliot Lake. And that any idea that we would shut down the mall or put the mall in jeopardy, no one's going to do that. So he used the term blind eye. People turned a blind eye in the city. There was plenty of evidence that the city officials, politicians knew that the roof leaked and nothing was done about it.
Nobody wanted to do anything.
There's one point, and this is relevant to today's discussion about the class action lawsuit. The class action suit, the representative plaintiffs were Jack and Elaine Quinney, and they owned a restaurant, or they ran a restaurant in the mall. I believe it was called Hungry Jack's. And a year before the collapse, she came to work. I think it was May 2011, so this would have been 13 months before the collapse. And 2 large chunks of concrete had fallen from the roof into her kitchen at the restaurant.
Oh, my goodness.
Almost like baseball bat size, like a large icicle,
yeah.
right? And they warned the city. She called the mall's owner. He did nothing. She complained to the city, and again, the report, the inquiry concluded that nothing was done. And basically, there's a moment in the report where I get emotional even just thinking about it. It's powerful what happened. And a sitting city councilor at the time, who's since passed away, went to the building commissioner at the time and said, "Hey, look what's going on here." And as quoted in the report, the city building official said, "Well, what do you want me to do? I'll close down the mall." And nothing was done about it, right? And this is 13 months before the thing falls down.
Unacceptable,
right? And again, we could spend hours talking about Elliot Lake, but the other fateful moment, of course, and I think a lot of people know this, is there was an engineering firm from Sault Ste. Marie that had done some structural analysis of the mall in the years before, and the current owner at the time it fell down was trying to get some refinancing. And part of that refinancing was to fix the roof, as he alleged, and as the commissioner didn't really believe. Mm-hmm. And part of that was he had to get a structural assessment. So he hired M.R. Wright and Associates, which was based in Sault Ste. Marie at the time, and Bob Wood was the engineer. We now know that he had actually been stripped of his engineering license at the time because of an unrelated project where he where there's some misconduct. So the Professional Engineers of Ontario had stripped him of his license, but he was still technically able to do inspections as long as another engineer stamped the inspection.
Right, yeah.
So I'm giving you the Coles Notes version, Scott, but what happened was April 12th, I still remember, April 12th, 2012. Yeah. So this is 6 weeks before the mall fell down. He drives from Sault Ste. Marie to Elliot Lake. He's there from 9 a.m. to 2:30 p.m., does no actual physical inspections of the mall. It's all visual. Talks about how the mall, seems structurally sound to him. He goes back to his engineering firm. And again, this is all in the public inquiry report. His coworker, who was an engineer, they had a discussion about it. He stamped the report. And then when he gave the report to the mall's owner actually asked for some changes in the report, which he did without telling his colleague who stamped the report, saying that one of the things was he changed the word ongoing leakage to just leakage. And then there was a photo of one of those yellow bladders that kind of became famous in the ceiling of the mall. It was collecting all the water and hosing it to buckets. One of those photos was removed. And 6 weeks later, the mall fell down. And Bob Wood actually, just to finish that thought off, he was the only person ever criminally charged in this case. The OPP charged him with criminal negligence causing death. Mm-hmm. The allegation being that any reasonable engineer who looked at this mall and did any rational inspection would have said this sounded the alarm bells. Yeah. And that's what an engineering firm hired by the OPP concluded. And he was charged. He was found not guilty. He was acquitted. The judge did not believe that it reached the threshold of criminal negligence. Right. So he was let off, which leaves us with all these lawsuits that have been filed, which is one of the other things, right? Today, yeah. I'm just going to go through my notes, Scott, because I feel like I'm forgetting something. But again, I've just been rereading everything and understanding everything that happened. It's all fresh in my head, but not fresh in my head.
How much time did you spend covering this tragedy?
It would have been at least 2 years, maybe 3, I would say. I was very blessed. I was a senior writer at Maclean's, and I just worked with the most amazing team of editors. I hope some of them are listening. None of them are, I'm sure. But they had so much patience and so much desire to tell the stories properly.
And get it right.
And spend time talking to people. And it was just a different opportunity. Maclean's is a national news magazine, and we had the opportunity to do that. Part of it was me also being stubborn because I thought the story was so important. I wanted to keep pushing it. So there were times when they didn't always agree, but then they still, in the end, were happy with the story, and it ended up in the magazine. Right. But I did a big investigative piece before the public inquiry, sort of outlining a lot of this stuff by talking to different people. And then the public inquiry began, and there was a big story that I did about, kind of tracking down everyone who was in the mall at that time based on documents that had been filed in the inquiry, based on my own interviews, and kind of piecing together that moment. And it's amazing that only 2 people were killed. That's a terrible thing to say. But if you look at the surveillance footage, there are people who bought a lottery ticket, for example, walked away, and the mall fell down. Yeah. There's a woman, I remember speaking to an older woman who's in the food court, who's about to go buy a lottery ticket. She looked at her, forgot she didn't have money, opened her purse, and because she stopped for that extra split second, the roof fell beside her and not on her.
The 2 people walking into the mall, right?
The surveillance footage of the collapse actually shows 2 people on the rooftop parking lot walking toward the stairs and in the door. Yeah. And when I tracked them down, they literally were on the last step that was hit as that stuff fell down onto the escalator and the stairs, hit her leg, hit some debris in the head, and her husband-to-be basically pulled her up and they were able to escape. And the tragic thing too is there was a car. This was a beautiful summer day, right? There was no rain. There was nothing. Nope. Nothing forecast. And so the last car that drove over this welded connection was, as the commission concluded, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the last thing it could handle, and then it gave way. And like I said, there was a lot of lawsuits filed too. The families of Lucy Alwyn and Dolores Pedrizzolo filed a lawsuit, I believe it was an $11 million lawsuit against multiple defendants. It was settled out of court. And then there were two other lawsuits, one filed by Foodland, which was one of the anchor tenants, and their ownership. And then this class action lawsuit, which was filed on behalf of, people who were injured in the mall, people who worked at the mall, lost their wages, business owners. So anyone who fits into this class, about 300 people, I think, potential class members. And to be honest, Scott, I thought that the case had finished years ago because, career moves on, life moves on, other things. Yep. I'm at Village Media now. I'm not covering this day to day. And when I saw the headlines the other day that they've reached a $10 million proposed settlement, I was genuinely shocked. I had no idea that they were still going on.
And brought it all back.
It kind of brought it all back. And it gave me a chance to sort of catch up with everything. And I reached out to David O'Connor, who's one of the lead lawyers representing the plaintiffs. He's represented them, I think, from the beginning. So he's been at this for 14 years as well. Yeah. And he's agreed to come on the show today and sort of explain sort of how, why it took this long and what it means for the people who are members of this class.
It took a split second for the parking deck at the Algo Center Mall to collapse, but the aftermath has lingered for 14 years. Two beloved members of the community were killed. Many others were injured. One engineer was criminally charged, then acquitted, and a class action lawsuit has slowly inched its way through the court. Until now, a proposed $10 million settlement has been reached pending the approval of a judge. Joining us tonight is one of the plaintiff's lead lawyers on the file, David O'Connor, a founding partner of the Toronto firm Roy O'Connor. David, welcome to A Closer Look. We appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
David, I know this is a loaded question to start with, but in a general sense, why did it take nearly 14 years to reach this point?
So just to back up for a second, we're going to be filing and posting on our website some affidavit material explaining how the case ends up here today. But let me give you a summary of that. A mediation started after the case was certified in 2014. That mediation went on for 3 to 4 years. The judge overseeing the action in Toronto basically directed us to continue that mediation. The mediation was before a retired Court of Appeal judge, Stephen Gouge, very experienced, very knowledgeable. We ended up in about 2022 at a point where we had the judge's estimate of what the damages might be. Unfortunately, at that point, Justice Gouge fully retired. He couldn't complete the process. We had to find a mediator who sort of came on board later in 2023, got a settlement offer in 2024, finalized it this year, 2025. And so it sounds very long. It is indeed the longest mediation that I've ever been involved in. But if you look at the details, there's a lot of explanation for it. Having said that, I'm sure to class members, the residents of Elliot Lake, this just looks like an inconceivably long period of time.
David, just a little background, just so we're clear. There's actually two lawsuits that are settling here, or proposed set to be settled here, which is the $10 million, the class action lawsuit, as well as the Foodland claim filed by the people who ran the grocery store at the mall as well.
That's right. The Foodland claim will be settling. It's not subject to court approval. If the judge approves the $10 million for the class action, my understanding is that the Foodland claim will be settled as well.
All right. I want to get into specifics of the settlement and who's eligible. But before we do, just basically the post that you put on your website announcing the proposed settlement called it a reasonable compromise and warned that if it's not approved, the parties could end up litigating this case for years to come. Why is this a reasonable compromise, do you think, David?
The mediator, retired Court of Appeal judge Stephen Gouge, for years reviewed the damages of the class members who'd come forward to us, which probably number in excess of 200, 220. Businesses, employees, injured people. Having reviewed that as a judge, the judge arrived at $11.7 million as his estimate of what the damages were in total. At the same time, I can tell you that Justice Gouge also indicated that if a settlement offer was made in the $10 million or $10.5 million range, we should accept it. And so And in the background, we had for years done our own evaluation of the claims. And so we knew and understand even today that $10 million is a reasonable compromise on the amount. Moreover, it's reasonable because class members have been waiting a very long time to get any compensation at all. And some would say justice delayed is justice denied. Mm-hmm. And it made more sense to us, and courts take into account timing on class action settlements, to get money now rather than fighting for 5 or 6 or 7 more years against defendants and making people wait in the hope that we might get a little bit more money. Unfortunately, that's a risk that we didn't feel was reasonable in the circumstances. The representative plaintiffs, the Quinties, also agreed that $10 million now was reasonable.
Mm-hmm. David, so who is eligible for this settlement?
So in class actions, there's a class definition. The definition includes the businesses in the mall, the employees in those businesses who lost wages, as well as any individuals who were in the mall and were harmed physically or psychologically. There are some nuances to that, but that's basically what it is. And we understand the number is probably in the range of between 275 and 300 businesses and individuals.
Mm-hmm. And so if the settlement's approved, David, there'll be a separate process to kind of assess each of these claims on its own to see where it fits and what percentage they would get.
That's right. We would be able, as lawyers, to evaluate each of the claims, as we have indeed as part of the lengthy mediation process. The problem is that we owe each class member the same duty to represent them. And so if we were forced to assign a value to each class member's claim, the possibility that any class member could think we weren't fighting hard enough for them would be obvious and would create what lawyers know would be a conflict. And so we've asked in the distribution plan for a third-party adjudicator to be approved by the court, who will review the claims and determine a reasonable value for each of the claims.
Yeah, that makes sense. I assume some of these people have passed away too, David. A lot of these people I interviewed at the time, I remember, were pretty elderly. Would their families be eligible for compensation?
Yes, estates are eligible to claim the compensation that would have been available to the individual.
Okay.
How long does that process take once everything is settled and then you look at each individual? How long is that process from the time that there's actually money in hand?
Well, it's difficult to answer, and I would say that months would be the hope. Say 3 to 6 months, and that may seem long again to people, although maybe not as long as the last 13 plus years. The difficulty is, particularly for personal injuries, people may have to get more medical records, and not surprising to anyone in Ontario or Canada, it can take some time just to get medical records, let alone get an opinion from your doctor. And I'm not blaming doctors for being critical of them, it's just the system.
Mm-hmm. Right. You mentioned Jack and Elaine Quinney, just so everyone knows. They were the class representatives on this lawsuit. They owned Hungry Jack's in the mall. And if I remember right from the public inquiry, a year before this collapse, pieces of concrete actually fell into their restaurant. So this has been many years that this, and they'd complained at the time. I guess my question is, how are they doing, David? Are they pleased with this settlement?
About a year and a half ago, they moved to Thunder Bay to be closer to some family. I think they are very pleased with the settlement. Like everyone else, they've been waiting a long time, and they have had their own struggles. In fact, Elaine was physically and emotionally injured in the collapse. She was actually at Hungry Jack's, call it 20 feet away from the food court, and was struck by debris. Still has lingering problems from that. Jack himself had a heart transplant, subsequently a kidney transplant. And they've had, their own financial issues because Hungry Jack's was their income. But through all of that, they've quite conscientiously and energetically acted as representative plaintiffs. And they are, I think, pleased that there is a substantial amount of money that can be distributed to people, and certainly pleased that it can be done sooner rather than later.
David, what has the reaction been from other class members?
So we get some contact from class members because, in fact, the notice directs questions to us. And most of the questions we've received, frankly, are how could I attend the settlement approval hearing on April the 10th, Zoom hearing? We haven't really received any critical comments from class members at our firm. Now, I can tell you that I've noticed on certain media sites that people have put comments after some of the stories that were posted, some of which involve people saying things like, it's taken too long, it's not enough money, the lawyers are the only ones who are getting money. Those are, and I'm not belittling them because they're genuine thoughts by people, particularly people who aren't involved in litigation all the time. But they are very common in class actions. That is, people look up and say, well, whatever the amount is, it should be more.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is they really don't have a basis on which to judge what the total amount should be.
Mm-hmm.
And people think, for example, if they've been injured, whatever amount a court would give them will never be enough because most people would pay money to avoid an injury and they pay a lot more than the court would ever award them. And as for the lawyers being the only ones that are making money, I can tell you that we will probably have in excess of $4 million in legal fees, about $200,000 in disbursements into this case, and we're going to get about $2.45 million. So to the extent that the class members think that they're going to have to take some sort of reduction or compromise, I join them by saying, we're doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And just, sorry, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Finish that thought. Sorry, David.
No, I was just going to say, and people look at a 25% contingency as somehow being large. The reality is that these contingency arrangements, that is, we only get paid if we win and we take a percentage, are there to allow people to get access to justice without paying for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we have cases where we've done these things, spent years and lost, and we get nothing. And the design of what some judges have called an entrepreneurial system or approach is that the lawyers who take the risk and put in the time and pay disbursements should get a pretty good premium at the end of the day. Not only are we not getting a premium, we're not even getting straight time covered. And I'm not complaining. That's the reality and the risk we take in these type of arrangements. But it is the system that provides the benefit to people that gives them access to court.
I appreciate that because I was going to ask you about the legal fees. But basically, just as you said, 25% of this $10 million settlement does go to legal fees. But as you mentioned, it's actually far less than what you've actually paid way more than that.
Well, we didn't pay anyone. It's the time that we would have billed on some other file that we spent on this file that we won't recover. And again, I am not complaining about that at all. That's the nature of the risky litigation that we act in.
That's right. All right, I do have to go over the numbers real quickly, David, because this is a big question people have too. So it's a $10 million proposed settlement. People want to know who's paying for it. According to the documents filed in court, the city of Elliot Lake would pay the most into this settlement, $3.5 million. Algoma Central Properties, which built the mall and owned it for 20 years, would pay $2 million. Eastwood Mall and Bob Nazarian, who was the last owner the day it collapsed, would pay $1.745 million. Retirement Living and its for-profit arm, Nordev, would pay $1 million each. They actually owned the mall between, if I remember right, 1999 and 2005. M.R. Wright and Associates and Bob Wood, who were the Sault Ste. Marie engineering firm that last inspected the mall, would pay $730,000. The Ontario government, i.e. the Ministry of Labor, would pay $400,000. Core Slab Structures, which provided the slabs that were on the top of the roof deck, would pay $225,000. And James Keewan, who was the original architect and who has since passed away, I assume it'd be his estate or his insurance, would pay $175,000. People might assume things when they see that breakdown, David. What does that mean that one will pay $3.5 million, one would pay $175,000? How do you come to those numbers?
I can say that it's a bit of a black box for us because when Justice Gouge retired, Chief Justice Warren Winkler took over, and he's a force in mediations. He spoke to the defendants independently of us and basically conducted a mediation towards the defendants and came up with the 10.775 joint offer to settle the class action and the food land claim. We weren't aware of the breakdown until it was put into the settlement agreement. I can tell you that the settlement agreement itself specifies that all the defendants deny liability. The splits and how Chief Justice Winkler arranged it are essentially unknown to us. But I can certainly tell you that while people assume that civil lawsuits achieve justice for everyone, the reality is that almost every civil lawsuit just results in a monetary award, money being exchanged. And from our perspective as counsel to the class members, we would rather get more money regardless who's paying. So to some extent, and I don't mean this to be flippant or casual, we were focused on the total, certainly not focused on who was contributing what.
Mm-hmm. So that we assume, I don't even know if you can speak to this, but we assume there were a lot of closed door discussions with the mediator talking about why someone might have to pay more or less.
I would assume, in most mediations and most settlements, there is at least some analysis of both the liability exposure and the damage exposure. I could sort of assume certain things. I just don't know what happened. There's also at times influence in settlements like this where there's multiple parties by virtue of the fact of what insurance money is left available. And that can also play a factor in who contributes what.
That makes sense.
I don't know for this particular case, however.
And do you know if they're all covered by insurance? You know if some of these plaintiffs will be on the hook for this money on their own?
I actually don't know that. And it's not something that we got into. It wouldn't have been relevant for purposes of arguing the case in court. So I'd have to apologize and decline to tell you the answer to that one.
That's okay. Would that be something that would eventually come out as part of the settlement hearing and as part of the approval hearing, or could that be something we would just never know?
It'll be something you'll never know. It's not a requirement that a defendant who's contributing to a settlement disclose whether it's out of their own corporate or personal pocket, or rather, alternatively, out of an insurance pocket.
Okay. Again, we appreciate your time. I know you have to go. In terms of closure, David, we often hear this term, we finally get some closure. Do we feel that we've reached that point in this case, or is there ever really going to be closure with this tragedy?
The lawyer in me says this is closure of the class action. But as we've discussed earlier, I think the evaluation of the claims and the distribution is going to go on for months.
Yep.
So it won't quite be closed even if the judge approves it on April the 10th. From a human perspective, and I'm no expert on that or psychology, but in my experience, when something as personal, as important and tragic as this was, occurs, no court settlement really closes that. It may be a chapter in the book of the collapse, but I fear, like some of the psychological issues, that this collapse will resonate and haunt a number of people for many years.
Absolutely. Real quickly, David, is there a message you'd have to any class members who might be listening to this podcast tonight?
My message would be attend the certification hearing, the settlement approval hearing on April the 10th. Before that, read the material we're going to post on our website, have a look at it, and I would urge you to read that material and accept some of the evidence in contrast to the sort of quite natural, quite understandable reaction of not enough, took too long, the lawyers are getting too much. I mean, we'll try to explain that in the material. It's hard to get that message across, but I'd urge people to try to absorb our material. And lastly, I would say, with all due respect to everyone, this is a very reasonable settlement, and I would urge people to support it rather than find a reason to complain.
David, before we let you go this evening, any points that we didn't cover that perhaps we should have?
No, I think you've covered basically everything. I mean, the only thing I would add is that I really do think that Jack and Elaine Quinty have been strong soldiers for this case for a long time. I mean, I can't imagine in a relatively small town, and I'm not saying that Elliot Lake is tiny, but if you show up at the Tim Hortons every day and you're the face of the class action, everyone is going to expect you to answer for what has or has not happened over the last 6 months, 6 years, 13 years. And the difficulty that the Quintys had is the same difficulty we had. We can't reveal settlement privileged information publicly. We can't put it on our website. If people called, we answered their questions. But we can't disclose information publicly without destroying the settlement privilege and probably driving the defendants away from the settlement table. And we certainly didn't want to do that. The Quintys were alive to that. And so they didn't have detailed answers they could give in public in the Tim Hortons or at the Rexall or at the supermarket. And so they faced a lot of questions and likely, understandably, a lot of criticism. And they did it while having their own psychological issues and their own financial issues. And I have a lot of respect for what they've done.
All right, there's David O'Connor, a founding partner of the Toronto law firm Roy O'Connor. David, we truly appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you, gents.
Well, I guess the good news after waiting 14 years, April 10th, and then maybe only a few more months after that.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, that Dave was able to shed some light on what they had decided on, or what the mediator or the retired Court of Appeal justice had said. Like, this is the most you're probably going to get is $11.7 million, right? And he was able actually to get the defendants to agree on this amount.
Yeah.
And it says very clearly in their posting online that this is not accepted, we could be taking years and years more to litigate this with no guarantee of how much money you'd get at the end, right? And so like I said at the top of the show, I was even surprised this was still going on.
Yeah.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of relief. I can tell you I met so many people who were elderly in 2012 who were in the mall or so, and I know, in fact, I know some of the people I interviewed have passed away. So their families will be able to apply for compensation. He's right about closure, right? Closure, I don't believe, is something that ever really comes. You don't fully get closure on anything.
I think you just move past things.
You move past things, and it works out the best way that you can. But I'm sure this money will mean a lot to people who suffered in different ways in the mall. So I can tell you I'll be watching the hearing on April 10th. I'll let you know how it goes.
All right. That's it for us this evening. Closer look at villagemedia.ca is our email address. And don't forget, you can sign up anytime to get new content sent to you on a regular basis. Closerlookpodcast.ca. Derek Turner at the helm this evening of tonight's show. As always, Michael Friscolanti, our editor-in-chief, and I'm Scott Sexsmith. Thanks for your time this evening. We'll do it again tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, right here on Closer Look.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.